This is the news from BRN. Welcome to this special investiture edition from the BRN team. Most of our program today will be devoted to our exclusive live coverage of the investiture of the new Viceroy of Egypt. We'll be going over to the Pharaoh's court in a few moments. In our regular magazine feature, Man in the News, the subject will be Joseph, the new Viceroy. And later in the program, we'll be listening to an economist's evaluation of Joseph's proposed economic strategy. And we shall also be reporting on the assassination of King Marcellus on his return from Babylon. The capital of Egypt is the scene of tremendous revelry and celebrations today. The occasion is the investiture of the new Viceroy of all Egypt, Joseph. Thousands of sightseers lined the route and followed the magnificent procession, anxious not to miss a rare chance to witness the splendor of Pharaoh's court. Since Joseph was born in Canaan and arrived in Egypt as a slave, his appointment has come as a complete surprise to Egyptian officials, especially as a short time ago the man was in jail on a charge of rape. We'll be investigating his remarkable change of fortune later in the program, but now, with the ceremony due to begin at any moment, we're going straight over to the Pharaoh's court.
And welcome to the Pharaoh's lavish residence. A hush has fallen over the huge crowd who've been waiting patiently for the ceremony to begin for several hours. People have arrived from all over Egypt for what promises to be one of the major social occasions of the year. As I look around the packed inner court, I can see many well-known faces among the gathered monarchs and nobles of the country. Some most magnificent costumes catch the eye. The ladies' jewelry glints in shafts of sunlight, and away to my left, on a platform reserved for the deity, stand the high priests of all the leading cults, their distinctive robes gently swirling in the light breeze. From my vantage point here, I can distinguish the high priests of the three most popular gods, Ammon of Thebes, Re of Heliopolis, and Ptah of Memphis. The court is lined with dancing girls and musicians who, until a few moments ago, were entertaining the massive crowd. Now they look with everyone else toward the main entrance, through which the Pharaoh is due to arrive. And here comes the Pharaoh's litter. He sits resplendent on his throne, borne by 10 of his elite guard, and followed by 2 priests bearing ceremonial fans. He's carried up the ramp into the inner courtyard, and his heavily draped ornate litter is carefully lowered to the ground. The guards restrain the crowd, who are straining to get a closer look at their monarch. And now we await Joseph. The large door over to my right opens, and the incumbent viceroy, dressed in a simple linen skirt and naked from the waist up, enters the court, accompanied by his official entourage. The group stops several yards from the throne, and Pharaoh, resplendent in richly embroidered robes and wearing the double crown of Egypt, raises his hand, inviting Joseph to approach him alone. And Joseph falls on hands and knees before the royal litter. As you can hear, the crowd is completely silent as the Pharaoh, with great ceremony, removes his signet ring and places it symbolically on the little finger of Joseph's left hand. Now the royal chamberlain, who's been standing at the Pharaoh's right hand, steps forward with the viceroy's robes of office, a magnificent gown worked in very fine linen. Now, with just a nod from the monarch, he slips the beautiful gown around Joseph's shoulders. Next, the chamberlain hands to Pharaoh the gold necklace which bears the viceroy's seal of office. And now the Pharaoh puts the chain around Joseph's neck. The Pharaoh begins his address. He is saying to Joseph that as Viceroy, he will rule over all Egypt, second only in power to Pharaoh himself. He tells him that no man in Egypt will be allowed to lift a hand or a foot without the permission of Joseph, the new Viceroy. And now, with the end of the Pharaoh's brief speech, which marks the end of the investiture ceremony, we're returning to the studio.
Well, we shall be going back to the Pharaoh's court in a few minutes' time for commentary as the Pharaoh and the new Viceroy ride away in their royal chariots. But first, here's our political editor with this week's edition of Man in the News, in which we'll hear how Joseph has made the dramatic switch from jailbird to Viceroy in only a few days.
Joseph's origins are still a mystery to everyone in Egypt. Although he calls himself a Hebrew, no details of his family have yet come to light. The only facts that we have at our disposal are that some 13 years ago, Joseph arrived in Egypt with a caravan of Ishmaelites to be sold as a slave. He was fortunate to be bought by Potiphar, the captain of the guard, who treated him well and soon spotted Joseph's administrative abilities. Joseph soon rose to prominence in Potiphar's household, becoming head of the entire estate and in charge of all the other servants. But trouble lay ahead. Joseph had grown into an extremely handsome young man, and because of this he attracted the advances of his master's beautiful wife. In the scandal which followed, she claimed that Joseph had tried to seduce her, while they were alone in the house. Despite strenuous denials by Joseph, her testimony was believed, and the young head servant was sent to prison for several years. Joseph was obviously destined to be good at whatever he did. Once more his leadership abilities came to the fore, and he was put in charge of all the other prisoners. And one day, his unique ability to interpret dreams came to his advantage. Two of the inmates were important officials of Pharaoh's household, the chief butler and the chief baker. Both had dreams on the same night. The butler dreamt that he was pressing grapes from a vine into Pharaoh's cup, and Joseph told him that this meant he would be reinstated in his job. In the baker's dream, birds ate the royal bread from baskets he was carrying, and Joseph said that he would be hanged. Both predictions came true. After this, Joseph spent 2 more long years in jail, forgotten by everyone, including the fortunate butler. But then his luck changed. It seems that Pharaoh was being troubled by obscure dreams, which none of the court astrologers could understand. It appears that the chief butler then remembered Joseph's remarkable perception and told the Pharaoh. Immediately, the prisoner was hastily dragged from his cell, washed, shaved, given clean civilian clothes, and taken to the king. The Pharaoh related his 2 nightmares. In the first dream, 7 fat cows were grazing by the river Nile when 7 lean cows appeared and ate the fat cattle. Later that same night, Pharaoh also dreamt that 7 fat ears of corn were consumed by 7 withered ears. Joseph understood the dreams immediately. He explained that for the next 7 years, Egypt would have bumper harvests and a full Nile. But this would be followed by 7 years of drought and famine. The Nile would dry up and cease to irrigate the land, and the harvests would be disastrous. Pharaoh clearly sensed the young man's unusual powers and believed these interpretations. With typical modesty, Joseph disclaimed all credit, saying that the prophecies had come from his God, the God of the Hebrews. Well, the rest of this amazing story is very simple. Joseph suggested that an administrator should be appointed with the job of conserving supplies for the next 7 years, so that food would be available during the lean times ahead. The Pharaoh didn't waste any time. By royal decree, there and then, he made Joseph Viceroy of Egypt, so that he could immediately implement his grain conservation policies. The amazing thing is that events have moved so quickly that many Egyptians don't really know much about the man whose appointment they are celebrating.
We've just heard that Joseph and the Pharaoh are about to leave the investiture ceremony, so let's go straight back to the royal court to find out what's happening.
Well, back here, a huge crowd has gathered outside the central court as we wait for Joseph, the newly invested viceroy, and the Pharaoh to appear. 2 gilded chariots, drawn by plumed horses with splendid harnesses, stand by to carry their important charges away. And there are signs of activity now. Royal guards with long staves are keeping the crowds back, but everyone wants the best view. And here comes the Pharaoh, closely accompanied by his bodyguards. An aide helps the king from his royal litter into the first chariot. and the driver cracks his whip, and away they go. And now here's Joseph. He too has an entourage of burly soldiers from the Royal Guard. Again, the crowd surge forward for a closer look, and the Viceroy is almost lost in a sea of people as he steps into the waiting chariot. And just a word of praise for the royal grooms. Apart from being immaculately turned out, both horses have been perfectly behaved under very trying conditions. Well, Joseph is safely aboard and on his way to the official Viceroy's residence, a little different from the squalid cell he occupied such a short time ago. And now, as the two chariots disappear from view, we return you to the studio.
Before we leave the subject of the new Viceroy, we now turn to our expert on economic affairs to find out how Joseph's appointment is likely to change Egypt's economic policy.
Well, I think that Joseph's recommendations on the domestic economy are pretty clear. There is little doubt that we shall see quite dramatic changes in policy. All surplus grain will be stored instead of being exported. I think where there will be speculation is over why Joseph has recommended this policy. He claims it is to protect Egypt from economic disaster in the event of the predicted famine. However, economists here and elsewhere are rather skeptical of this. They feel that Joseph's prime motive may be to increase the Pharaoh's wealth and power, and so enhance his own political standing.
Well, what effect will Joseph's policy have on Egypt during the next 7 years?
Well, at the moment, the Egyptian economy is quite strong, with trade extending to all parts of the eastern Mediterranean. The crop this year has been a bumper one, with plenty of wheat for export to Canaan and the northeast. It is these favourable trade figures and crop returns which have made economists wary of the proposed change in policy. You see, the changes will take foodstuffs out of the lucrative export market and instead put them in grain silos for storage, where they cannot add to the real wealth of Egyptian farmers and merchants. There could also be unbearable pressure on Egypt's foreign trade agreements.
But surely isn't he introducing this policy to protect the country from 7 years of famine?
Well, in fact, Joseph could have a purely political motive. If, as he predicts, the 7 years of famine do arrive, the Pharaoh will have a monopoly of all the foodstuffs available. To buy food, Egyptians will be forced to sell their property or mortgage their homes to the government. In effect, this will mean that by the end of the famine, the Pharaoh could own all the private land and property in Egypt, with the obvious exception of the lands of the wealthy priesthood. The country will not have starved, but at the same time, the Pharaoh will have strengthened his hand enormously at the expense of his rivals. So one really wonders what Joseph's personal motives are. Is he genuinely intentioned, or is he feathering his own political nest? We may have to wait 14 years to find out.
And now here's the rest of the news. King Merciless, the brilliant leader of the Hittite army, has been assassinated. The incident happened soon after the king and his triumphant army had returned from their conquest of the famous city of Babylon. Reports say that a conspiracy had been hatched in the absence of the young king, and instead of the hero's welcome he deserved, he was ruthlessly murdered by a member of his own royal household. Our foreign correspondent says that the assassination has brought into the open mounting dissensions within the royal palace and could indicate a bitter and bloody few years ahead for the Hittite monarchy. Latest reports from Babylon speak of the difficult task of rebuilding the city, which was so badly sacked and pillaged by Merciless's army. People everywhere are lamenting the destruction of this great city and the end of the dynasty which was started by the powerful King Hammurabi. Of course, Babylon's most important contribution was Hammurabi's famous Law Code, which appeared well over 100 years ago. This document contains legal concepts which are gradually becoming accepted everywhere. Severe punishments were instituted for murder, theft, adultery, or any injury caused by one man to another. For example, a man would be held responsible if his ox gored his neighbor, and even personal matters such as marriage and divorce were covered. So although people are mourning the destruction of the city, it seems certain that Babylon's cultural contributions will stand the test of time. And now here are the news headlines again. An ex-slave from Canaan, Joseph, who only days ago was in prison on a charge of rape, was today invested as Viceroy of all Egypt. He seems certain to introduce new economic policies by putting an embargo on all food exports. King Merciless, the bold leader of the Hittite army, has been assassinated. He had just returned from a triumphant assault on Babylon. And that's all for this week, and now from the BRN team, goodbye.